Oh, excuse me, you caught me eating ice cream. We are still continuing our ice cream social here at Irvington Historical Society. We have some great deals, and this is what we have going on. It's become Ice Cream Social Week, really. Last week we had some great sales. We've reduced the price. We still have some flavors left, so we're encouraging you to come in and get some ice cream to go and clean us out here, and you can help the Irvington Historical Society in that way. So what's the tie-in? Our subject today said it would be classicism, and we'll continue that from last week. So what's the tie-in between ice cream and classicism? Well, I did a little digging around and found that in ancient times there was a kind of an ice cream in Hellenistic and ancient times. It consisted of shaved ice flavored with honey, which sounds pretty darn good, really. So coming back to classicism in the Bona Thompson Center, I have my diagram here that we talked about last week. And this diagram talks about all the different components of classicism that are on the outside of the Bona Thompson Center. One of the things that's so great about the Bona Thompson Center is that it was really ahead of the curve of this kind of American version of monumental classicism that was popular in the 1890s through the 1920s. And we were ahead of the curve because as far as surviving buildings that represent this trend, this building was completed in 1903. There are really great examples in Indianapolis. You have the Indiana World War Memorial, that's from the 1920s, much later. Central Library, 1917 is when it was completed. The Old City Hall that used to be the State Museum on Alabama, 202 North Alabama in Indianapolis, that building's completed in about 1909. Our old federal building down on New York Street there, down between Ohio and New York, that building was completed in about 1905. So 1903, really the shining example of American classicism. And you can see it all on the exterior. So going from our diagram here and starting with the main elements of classicism, we're going to talk about the exterior, then we're going to go real quickly to the inside. So Steve is panning up to the outside of the building, and the first thing that catches your attention about this building is it has a portico. That is that enframed area of limestone at the center entry that has a triangular pediment at the top. Classical buildings very often have a portico, and most of the better examples of classical architecture have columns. And here the columns are kind of trapped between these bits of wall that stick out on either side. They look like square columns, but they're called antae, which means wall in Greek. So these are two columns between walls. In architecture speak, that's Ionic distyle in antis. So you can impress your friends with that. At the top, though, there's just all kinds of incredible classical detail. And concentrating on the tops of the columns, of course, you have the Ionic scroll, the volute, that looks kind of like a cushiony bed that's scrolling around on either side. And above that, you have a certain kind of molding that's classical. Below that, you have bands of classical moldings. You have a sort of a round donut-like molding right under the column that has this crisscross molding to it. That's called a guilloche. Then you have the egg and dart. You can tell that right away even if you don't know the moldings, because you can see the egg shapes. Below that, there is a bead and reel, very thin molding. And then you have a wide band that has a palm leaf motif on it. That is called a palmette. And so these are very ornamental form of classicism. It's supposed to be modeled after an ancient monument called the Temple of the Winds that was in Athens. And a lot of architects would kind of make that affectation. I've modeled my version of the Ionic column on such and such a temple from ancient times. This architect was very adept at doing that and very skilled, as you can see. The other thing that's classical is the use of round arches. The Romans were more fond of using arches, and of course we have a beautiful arch over our main entry here with the keystone. The carving in the keystone is acanthus. Now, the acanthus plant in the Mediterranean grows almost like a weed, but yet in classical times they were fond of carving that as a way to ornament a building. So the tops of capitals of columns, moldings, keystones in this case, carved with that acanthus motif. That's a very clear classical reference. We're going to go ahead and go in the building and take a look at and see how the architect carried that classical theme through. So when you have the expectation, you come to a building like this, you say, my goodness, what am I going to see when I go inside a place like this? It's a library. I think I'm going to learn something important. When you go in, the architect very much conveys that as well, and we'll see that. You have the steps here. The side of these steps is where all the Butler sports teams enjoyed posing for photographs. You can see why the light is great today. We get the summer sun right on us. This building is angled ever so slightly to the southeast. It's not facing true east. All the sports teams like to pose here, and of course the Irvington campus is where all the great Butler sports traditions really started. All the football, basketball, track, all the great sports teams, they first had their athletic competitions here on the Irvington campus. We're going to come on in. And the first thing that you see when you come in is you see beautiful mosaic tile floors. The art of mosaic is an ancient one and was very popular in classical times. So using that kind of floor in a building like this, again, points you towards that classical tradition. One of the very key classical ornaments, this sort of running meander border here, is very much an ancient Greek motif that the architect borrowed. Another classical motif, the symbolism of the victory wreath. So what's being shown as victorious here? Books, literature, learning. When you come in here, you're going to be a victor because you're going to learn something. So you're being told these things right away when you come in. And then when you lift your gaze upward and you see the vault, you really think to yourself, goodness, what an incredible, inspiring space. I really am going to learn something important in here. This really feels very uplifting when you came in here as a student 120 years ago. We're going to go ahead and come on into one of the reading rooms here. The reading rooms have a sort of a grid pattern on the floor. This is reinforced concrete. That's another remarkable thing about this building. The main floor has no wood structure to it. In most libraries of this time, the exterior would be a masonry shell. The interior floors would have a wooden joist and wooden floor system to them. None of that here. Reinforced concrete. One of the very early uses in 1903, one of the very early uses remaining in the city of that kind of technology. And again, when you come into this space and you look upward, there's a gridded ceiling. We had to recreate the gridded ceiling and the vaulted ceiling in the other room because they had been removed. But you have this very lofty, airy feeling space that's very inspiring. And while, yes, the architect spent a lot of money making a two-story volume space when perhaps more square footage could have been used, there is a very functional aspect to these large windows. These large windows then let light down onto your subject matter from over your shoulder. So they're beautiful and they're practical as well. Right now we have no artificial light on in this room, and this is how bright it is. It's really quite perfect illumination. And in fact, the architect chose the glass to refract light. It's sort of a pebbly texture of glass, and when we restored the building, we were able to find glass that matched that for the broken panes in order to give that same feeling. So you wouldn't get really sharp direct light, you would get diffused light filtered through these pebbly glass windows. The other interesting thing about this building, there was a central plan aspect to this building. This originally was where a curving librarian's desk came out. The librarians would be in the middle of the building. There would have been a doorway here that's long gone. And the librarian would have been able to come through here and accept books back from you or bring reading materials, research materials to you from a central location. So we're going to come back here, and this is where the main desk would have been. So when you came in the building, librarian would have been back here. The stacks of books would have been back in the back, which is where all the research materials would have been back there. So you would have asked for materials. These were what we would call closed stacks today, not the kind of library setup you're used to, where you simply go in. Certainly under better circumstances, you go in, you take the book you want off the shelf, and then you say, "I'd like to check this out." You say to the librarian, in this case, "I'm interested in ancient Greek history. Can you find me some books?" They would go back and find them and bring them to you. They would do the searching through the stacks for you. Here's a good example of what the building looked like. So there was even more classicism to the building that's unfortunately gone, was long gone at the start of our project. Here's one of the rounded desks, and you can see the beautiful moldings, very classical moldings around the doors and windows and so forth. Those were gone. There was marble wainscoting and marble banding at the base of the walls. We don't know where all that went. It's all gone now, but that would have certainly added to the enriching feeling you would have had when you came into this building. So we're going to wrap it up. We thank you for joining us. Sorry about the earlier snafu. We lost contact with you there. I encourage you to visit our website, which is, help me, Steve. UrvingtonHistoricalSociety.info. And you can make a donation there. Of course, we are opening up some programming here. We still have a lot of bills and a lot of needs. If you can become a member and support us, or slip us a $20 bill, something like that, we would greatly appreciate it. We thank you for your support, and we'll be seeing you in the weeks to come. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.